It was once believed that if you left food out to rot, living creatures like maggots and even rats would simply poof into existence. The idea was called spontaneous generation. A series of experiments starting in the 1600s disproved this idea, and in the 1800s, a new scientific law was proposed. Life only comes from life. It's true that rats, maggots, and even microbes are far too complex to simply poof into existence, but in 1859, English naturalist Charles Darwin put forth the theory of evolution. In it, he showed that under the right circumstances, relatively simple creatures can gradually give rise to more complex creatures. Given this information, serious thinkers began to wonder, is it possible that simple life forms actually could come from non-living matter? Not by poofing into existence, but through a natural gradual process similar to what we see in biological evolution. Darwin himself mentioned this idea when writing to a friend. But if, and oh what a big if, he wrote, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sorts of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity, and so on present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. In 1924, Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin published a book which he titled The Origin of Life. In it, he outlined his thoughts on a gradual progression from simple chemistry to living cells. He imagined the early ocean as a primordial soup, a rich collection of complex molecules produced by natural chemical reactions. In this soup, further reactions could take place, eventually producing living cells. At the time, Darwin's warm little pond and Oparin's primordial soup were really just speculation. They were founded on a good understanding of chemistry and biology, but they could not be considered legitimate scientific hypotheses because no one had found a way to test or observe them. Science, after all, is the study of observable facts and an ongoing conversation about how those facts can be best linked together. Chemical reactions like those proposed by Darwin and Oparin are not expected to leave an observable fossil record. Without either having fossils to examine or a time machine to travel back and observe what happened, how could scientists even begin to study the origin of life? In the 1950s, Stanley Miller, then a graduate student at the University of Chicago, came up with an idea. We could simulate early Earth conditions in the lab and then carefully watch what happens. If you can't study fish in the sea, set up an aquarium. Working with his professor, Harold Urey, Miller designed an apparatus to simulate the ancient water cycle. Together they put in water to model the ancient ocean. It was gently boiled to mimic evaporation. Along with water vapor, for gases of the atmosphere they chose methane, hydrogen, and ammonia. These are simple gases which scientists at the time thought were probably abundant on the ancient Earth. They added a condenser to cool the atmosphere, allowing water molecules to form drops and fall back into their ocean like rain. The ancient Earth would have had many sources of energy, sunlight, geothermal heat, and even thunderstorms, so they added sparks to the atmosphere to simulate lightning. The goal of the experiment was not to create life, but to simply test the first step in Oparin's model. Can simple chemistry naturally give rise to the complex molecules of life? After running the experiment for just 1 week, their ocean became brownish black. Careful analysis revealed that through a series of reactions, many complex molecules had been produced. Among these were amino acids, special molecules of life that we once thought could only be built inside the bodies of living creatures. This was a pivotal breakthrough in science, so significant in fact that it gave rise to an entirely new field of research now known as prebiotic chemistry.
Called the Miller-Urey experiment. Now, the Miller-Urey experiment, throw up the next slide there for me. This is a picture. If you ever took biology or chemistry, you've probably seen something like this in your textbooks. It was Miller and Urey in 1953 were trying to explain how the first life could come from non-life. So they took the chemicals and gases they thought were on the early Earth, zapped them with lightning, passed them through a beaker, and at the end collected the sample of it. You know what they found? Amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. This was heralded as a major scientific breakthrough. In fact, Carl Sagan said, quote, "This is the single most significant step in convincing many scientists that life is likely to be abundant in the universe." In fact, it was this very experiment that convinced one of the leading Christian apologists today, when in high school, to abandon his faith and become an atheist. Isn't that amazing how a science experiment can have such implications in somebody's life? So ironically, this experiment, one of my first challenges to it, is the experiment itself was actually designed. There's the fingerprints of intelligence all over this experiment, and yet in nature there can't be any information input at all if there's no God. My second problem with this is that old Disney movie, I forgot what it's called, where he's singing songs and years ago. Oh, Fantasia, right? You know Fantasia? Remember when, none of you are shaking your head. I'm not that old. Okay. He goes in a volcano and Mickey like zaps the volcano stuff and life comes out of it. You remember this scene? The idea is that there was this warm puddle of just these chemicals and life emerges from it. That's what Darwin thought. There's not a shred of evidence for this prebiotic soup at all. There's no evidence it even existed. Third problem is what Lee Strobel pointed out in that video, is we now know they used the wrong gases in that experiment. If you use the right gases, you don't get life. But fourth, and I think most significantly, is that, can anyone tell me what's the simplest form of life? It's a cell. That's right, someone got it. The simplest form of life is a cell. An amino acid isn't close to a cell. Lee Strobel said it's like a brick to a skyscraper. I think he underestimated it. It's like a brick to the entire city of Chicago. What does it take to go from a brick to a city? Information and intelligence to arrange it in a certain way. If you take out God, there's no information or intelligence to guide the process. That's why 40 years after this first experiment, even Miller himself said, the problem of the origin of life has turned out to be much more difficult than I and most other people envisioned. Massimo Pigliucci, an outspoken atheist biologist, said, unfortunately, Miller-type experiments have not progressed much further than their original prototype, leaving us with a sour aftertaste from the primordial soup. And yet, as you'll see in the next picture, it shows up in textbooks over and over again. With only one side, it says, this and other experiments suggested how simple compounds on Earth could have combined to form the organic compounds needed for life. Look, does the evidence for evolution seem fact when both sides are considered? I don't think so.
Scientists don't know for sure if the gases used by Miller really were the most common gases of the ancient Earth. Because of this, many experiments have since been done, showing that the molecules of life can form in a wide variety of environments with different starting chemicals and different sources of energy. Sugars, lipids, and amino acids have even been found on meteorites. This suggests that the molecules of life formed all throughout the ancient solar system and may be forming right now in other regions of our galaxy. Together, these discoveries tell us that Oparin's primordial soup and Darwin's warm little pond could have easily existed in one way or another on our ancient planet. So to sum things up, what was the Miller-Urey experiment? The Miller-Urey experiment was our first attempt at simulating ancient Earth conditions, in this case, the ancient Earth's water cycle, for the purpose of testing ideas about the origin of life. The Miller-Urey experiment is significant for two main reasons. First, though it was not a perfect simulation of the early Earth, it clearly demonstrated for the first time that biomolecules can form under ancient Earth-like conditions. Second, the experiment took what was once mere speculation, the idea that life may have emerged from chemistry, and transformed a portion of that speculation into legitimate, testable science. Many questions remain to be answered about the origin of life, but scientists from many nations and many fields of study are now following Stanley Miller's lead. They're finding ways to turn those questions about the origin of life into testable, scientific hypotheses. Simulation experiments cannot tell us exactly how life formed in the past, but if enough of them are done, they could eventually tell us if it's possible for life to emerge from chemistry.
And I have 2 points to make about this. First, I think that the theory of biological evolution is simply irrelevant to the truth of Christian theism. Genesis 1 admits all manner of different interpretations, and one is by no means committed to six-day creationism. Howard Van Til, who is a professor at Calvin College, writes, "Is the concept of special creation required of all persons who trust in the Creator God of Scripture? Most Christians in my acquaintance who are engaged with either scientific or biblical scholarship have concluded that the special creationist picture of the world's formation is not a necessary component of Christian belief. Nor is this a retreat caused by modern science. St. Augustine in the AD 300s, in his commentary on Genesis, pointed out that the days don't need to be taken literally, nor need the creation be a few thousand years ago. Indeed, he suggested that God made the world with certain special potencies that would gradually unfold over time and develop. And this interpretation came 1,500 years before Darwin, so that it is not a forced retreat in the face of modern science. So any doubts that I would have about the theory of biological evolution would be not biblical, but rather scientific. Namely, what it imagines is fantastically improbable. Barrow and Tipler, 2 physicists, in their book, The Anthropic Cosmological Principle, list 10 steps in the course of human evolution, each of which is so improbable that before it would occur, the sun would have ceased to be a main sequence star and incinerated the Earth. And they calculate the probability of the evolution of the human genome to be somewhere between 4 to the negative 180th power to the 110,000th power, and 4 to the negative 360th power to the 110,000th power. So if evolution did occur on this planet, it was literally a miracle, and therefore evidence for the existence of God. So I don't think this is an argument for atheism. Quite the contrary, it really provides good grounds for thinking that God superintended the process of biological development. So the Christian can be open to the evidence to follow it where it leads. By contrast, as Alvin Plantinga has said, for the naturalist, evolution is the only game in town. No matter how fantastic the odds, no matter how improbable, it's got to be true, because there is no intelligent creator and designer. So in one sense, you've got to feel a little sorry for the atheist. He can't really follow the evidence where it leads. His presuppositions determine the outcome. By contrast, if there is a fine-tuner and creator of the universe, then already in the initial conditions of the Big Bang, you have an elaborately designed universe that permits the evolution and existence of intelligent life. And I think evolution simply layers on more improbability. Now,
I'm John Perry, and that's the Miller-Urey experiment stated clearly.